Today, we're joined by special guest Morgan Pickering, who is the Outreach Chair for NAMI's Frontline Wellness, a CPS in mental health, and subject matter expert in trauma. Did I cover everything?
Um, a good bit, yeah. That's a pretty good intro.
All right, awesome. So today we're just going to be talking about some of your frequently asked questions surrounding trauma, and we're just going to start and just go right through it. All right. So
Okay.
first question is, what is trauma and how do we define trauma?
Oh, I love this question. So on the Googles, there are all kinds of descriptions of what trauma is. But for me and the work that I do, I describe trauma as an event or series of events that overwhelms our ability to cope, both in the mind and body. So that is kind of the generalized definition that I give as to what trauma is.
Okay. So how is trauma different from a bad experience, such as being scared or anxious?
So with trauma compared to, maybe someone being startled or someone having like anxiety about speaking in front of folks, the biggest difference is is trauma is a lot more complex than just a single startle or a little bit of anxiety. Okay. So depending on the person, so trauma can be an event like a natural disaster. Trauma can be domestic violence. Trauma can be what is called sensory overload, which is something that a lot of people don't quite um, really see as something that's trauma. And what I mean by sensory overload is, let's say we have, hypothetical scenario. Maybe you lose your job. And of course, that's really saddening for the average person. I can understand someone feeling a little bit of panic. Nobody likes to be fired or get laid off, right? So then let's throw in maybe you're financially unstable, and now that you've lost your job, maybe now you're so far behind in your mortgage that your house gets foreclosed on. So that's another added stressor. Then let's say you end up homeless and maybe you have a child to take care of. All of those events individually may not be traumatic to the average person, but when all of it happens together, it can create a disorder in the way that we perceive threats, in the way that we perceive stress. I feel like that's might be the simplest explanation. The average person feeling a little bit of anxiety is normal. But compared to someone who's experienced trauma, speaking in front of people may be much more than just generalized anxiety. They may have flashbacks of talking in front of people and maybe they were humiliated, or maybe someone feels overwhelmed by, they're afraid of how they're going to be received, shame, guilt, those kinds of things. So it's a lot more complex than just the average anxiety towards specific events.
So this may go along with a future question, but just coming off of that, uh, trauma also affects relationships with others, right?
Yes, it does. Especially those who have experienced domestic violence, whether that's, during childhood years or even in the adult years. But uh, how trauma affects relationships with interpersonal relationships is maybe we experience something traumatic with a person and we're so fearful that that's going to happen again, or maybe we get so comfortable in the chaos of the relationship that we go seeking other chaotic relationships, and then it becomes a disordered relationship, in the sense that you can't tell who's safe and who's not. It can affect relationships where, let's say someone has been, let's say, conditioned to not share their feelings. When they get a partner or a friend that is open to sharing their feelings, there's often a headbutt because maybe this person was shamed in their past for sharing their feelings about something, and the other person can't quite relate to that. And it can cause issues in a relationship, whether that's romantic relationships, friendships, work relationships. Those kinds of factors are, they definitely affect a relationship no matter what it is.
Well, since trauma is so multi-layered and multifaceted when it comes to affecting relationships, is there overlap or misdiagnosis and confusion between trauma and something else like borderline personality disorder? Like, is there a lot of misdiagnosis?
Um, when we're talking about PTSD specifically, I do believe that that can be the case. PTSD, in my opinion, is all encompassing. If someone is diagnosed with PTSD, of course they have depression. Of course they have anxiety. Of course they have insomnia.
Mm.
But where trauma can kind of be either misdiagnosed or misinterpreted is, borderline personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. Those are both trauma response personality disorders.
Wow.
Those are derived from domestic violence. Those are derived from neglect. And so, yes, there's PTSD encompassed in that, but the disorders that like borderline and narcissistic personality disorders are rooted in trauma.
So another disorder, substance use disorder. How common is that?
Extremely common. Most people that I have worked with and or gotten to know that live with a substance use disorder, most of them did experience trauma in some way, shape, or form. Not every person has childhood trauma, but almost all of them have experienced trauma, especially in their adult lives. Whether that is a tumultuous relationship, maybe it's coping with things that they didn't know was trauma. Speaking from my own personal experience, I was 26 before I learned that I spent 21 years in domestic violence. Some people don't quite know where the substance use came from, other than knowing that they were trying to cope with something. And that something, more often than not, is a trauma. um you know there's a lot of, like, when we talk about substance use disorders, when people are in active addiction, they do a lot of things and get into a lot of scenarios that can be traumatic, but then also can enhance already accumulated traumatic experiences.
Do you notice if other like mood disorders co-occur with trauma, such as like bipolar or major depression? Is there a lot of that overlap too?
Yes. And in fact, when we look at adolescents, upwards of the age of 24 and younger, okay, most of us who work in mental health care, we see the surge in bipolar disorder and oppositional defiant disorder and ADHD. However, diagnostic symptoms of trauma response in adolescents are identical to those particular diagnoses. So the behavioral issues of ADHD, behavioral issues of oppositional defiant disorder, maybe even the rapid changing in moods with bipolar disorder. In adolescence, those are identically symptomatic to trauma response. So more often than not, children are not screened for trauma before they are given a diagnosis of ADHD, ODD, and bipolar disorder, which, not every clinician is trauma informed. Not every clinician screens for this, but behaviorally and diagnostically, it is identical.
How does trauma manifest in with adults in other domains, such as say poor decision making or driving recklessly or other types of behavioral side of PTSD?
Okay, so I like to use the example of the angry coworker. The one that comes in is just absolutely insufferable. They seem like just this angry, miserable person. More often than not, if we ask the question of like, hey man, what happened? Like, how did we get here? Especially if maybe this person was like really happy and went to all the work functions and stuff on the regular basis, and now they just feel like a dark cloud has entered the room. More often than not, something or a series of events have happened. But this person is often very angry. They may get sick often because the stress response takes its toll on the immune system. This person may have gaps in their memory, because when we are dealing with toxic stress and trauma, our ability to make memories is impaired. So neurologically, with trauma response, especially in adults, when someone is experiencing toxic stress or what we call an activating scenario, or formerly known as being triggered, the prefrontal cortex of the brain goes completely offline.
Mm.
Now, in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, that's where your rationalization is. That's where your personality lies. That's where being able to retain conversations happens. But when someone is dealing with trauma, that is completely affected and it is offline. That person is then functioning with their amygdala, which is their stress response. So this looks like being very irritable. The slightest thing, they will blow up on you, even though it's not really that big a deal. It feels like a big deal to them because their nervous system is so overwhelmed that they aren't able to articulate their feelings. And then when we talk about anger, anger is usually the response that we get. Usually, someone's fight or flight. And anger is very much a superficial emotion. There's always something under that. Whether that's grief, whether that's embarrassment, whether that's being overwhelmed or feeling betrayed, we don't know until we have those conversations of, hey, what happened?
How does it show up in romantic relationships?
Oh, I love this question. So how does it show up in romantic relationships? Do you mind if I give you a personal
Sure,
example?
by all
Okay.
means.
So, when I first met my current husband, I was homeless and I had just left a domestic violence relationship. It was safer for me to live out of my car than it was to go home. And my current husband quite literally picked me up off the street and gave me a whole new life. And you would think that that would be the happily ever after. You go live this wonderful life and everything is wonderful and it's great and you're so in love. And then 3 years in, I start noticing that I'm attention seeking and I'm acting recklessly and I'm doing like I'm shut down. I had the attitude of don't ask me any questions. I don't have to answer you, blah, blah, blah. Enough of that finally prompted me to go to therapy for the first time. And I didn't really have an answer for my behavior. I really could not tell you why I was doing these things. I couldn't tell you why I was pushing him away. I couldn't tell you why I was attention seeking. I was just doing what I did. And it was my second therapy session that I learned that it was self-destructive behavior. I felt because of the 21 years of domestic violence that I didn't deserve someone to take me in off the street and give me a whole new life. I felt unworthy. I felt a lot of shame and a lot of guilt. And that put a disconnect between me and my spouse because all he was trying to do was love me and all I was doing was rejecting it. And so that creates a lot of issues with relationships because sometimes we don't know why we're doing the things that we do until we dive deeper, until we look for those answers. And more often than not, it is some form of relational trauma.
How does your husband or how do the partners, how's the best support to give to someone who's experiencing?
Ooh, learning that projection is real. Okay. And what I mean by projection, and I know that it's a concept that a lot of people have a really hard time accepting, but how people treat you says way more about what they have going on than what you have done. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So my actions and what I did or didn't do was reflective of how I felt on the inside, and it had nothing to do with what he did. So learning projection and not taking the lashing out, not taking the behaviors or lack thereof as personal, especially when the person's making the effort to kind of look deeper into themselves. I know that that's not an easy feat. I know that seems kind of impossible when you're so emotionally connected to someone. But the other biggest supports co-regulation. So when I'm in fight or flight, and all I want to do is scream and yell and slam cabinet doors and slam doors and just throw things. I can't calm this down if someone is matching my energy. What calms me down is for someone to just sit there and they be the one that remains calm. Now, I understand that's not fully realistic for every relationship because everybody's dealing with their own stuff. But co-regulation has been pretty helpful for me in particular and others with dealing with crisis response. You can't meet chaotic energy and expect anything to really like subside. The remaining calm through the storm is a big help. Again, I'm not saying that that's easy, especially if it's an emotionally charged relationship. But fighting fire with fire does not work.
What is the difference between PTSD and CPTSD?
Oh, I love this question. Okay. So PTSD can derive from a single event. It can derive from a lot of different events. But nonetheless, PTSD in and of itself is something that is acquired in adulthood. CPTSD, more often than not, encompasses childhood trauma. So it can encompass childhood trauma, whether that's molestation, whether that's domestic violence, whether that's natural disaster witnesses. It specifically happens in childhood, which then carries over into adulthood with the disordered behaviors, the disordered relationships. In addition to that, CPTSD can be acquired through longevity of a domestic violence relationship. So let's say someone is in a violent narcissistic relationship for 10 to 20 years. That person would show signs of complex PTSD. Outside of those particular scenarios, more often than not, it is specific to childhood trauma. That's the biggest difference. Complex PTSD, something happened in childhood developmental ages, and then PTSD, more often than not, was acquired during adulthood.
So how do children internalize this trauma? How does it make them feel?
Hopeless, helpless, and worthless
Okay.
is my experience. You know, my experience with domestic violence was I'm an only child, and I grew up in a household where my father was very violent, and I took the brunt of the violence. My mother was never hit or anything, but my mother was present, but also not. Very much a shell of a human. And their whole marriage was just very tumultuous. And I was, front row seat to it all. And I took the brunt of everyone's disdain for one another. So I internalized that as being the workaholic, the athlete. Even though I did those things, I still battled with the internalization of hopeless, helpless, worthless. Because if I couldn't make my own parents proud or love me, how was I ever going to have someone else do that for me? And that's something that a lot of us who grew up in those particular scenarios feel. We feel invisible. Self-destructive behavior that we were talking about earlier, sometimes that comes from not being seen or heard. This can be self-destructive behavior, or the not being seen or heard can look like a very prestigious career and having to be a perfectionist and having to, look for validation because they never got it.
So are there any medications to mitigate, say, night terrors or things like that that psychiatrists can use?
Yes, there are medications. Typically, antidepressants are common with post-traumatic stress disorder. But also sleeping medications such as trazodone is very common. There's a few different ones, but a lot of them, for the most part, are the antidepressants. And what we notice with medication implementation in the treatment of trauma is that it will assist our nervous system in not being as activated when certain things happen. Sleep is a huge thing for PTSD. one thing that it was vastly misunderstood even by myself is that sleep has such an impact on how we handle things in our day to day. It has such an impact on our nervous system and how we can interpret and cope with certain things. So sleeping medications are very, very common for those who live with PTSD. Antidepressants are very, very common with PTSD. There are some anti-anxiety medications that are specific for anxiety.
EMDR, is EMDR a treatment for trauma? And
Yes.
how does that, yeah.
How does EMDR work?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's the one with the fingers, right?
It can be the finger, but now it's more of a light bar. It's just a light that you follow on this bar. And then there are like the vibrating pieces. My therapist calls them buzzies, and they vibrate. And what they do is that they help stimulate the vagus nerve, which is where our anxiety lies. And what EMDR does is the best way that I can kind of paint a mental picture for it is if you've seen Bruce Almighty. Have you seen Bruce Almighty?
Once.
Okay. So there's a scene where he goes to open up a file cabinet and it just goes on and on and on.
Yeah, yeah.
So keep the concept of the file cabinet, right? So when certain traumatic things happen, I want to call these memories like the pieces of paper floating in the air.
Mm.
Okay. So these pieces of paper are the traumatic experiences that we've acquired, big T, little t, whatever you want to call it. It can be a minor trauma, or it can be a big trauma. But nonetheless, these memories are stuck floating in the air. And what EMDR does is it allows for these stuck memories to properly go into the file cabinet of the brain where the brain can fully process the event that happened. EMDR, it takes these unprocessed memories, these unprocessed feelings and emotions, and it files them where it's supposed to go so that it desensitizes us to it. I'm going to do my best to paint a mental picture of what this sounds like. So if we've still got the memory floating up in the air and something reminds us of this memory, if it's still floating up in the air, we're going to be quick to respond, and it's not going to be a well thought out response. It's usually fight or flight. But if this memory is filed the way it should be, when these triggers come up, when these memories come up, there's not as strong of a reaction to it. It is a faded memory. That being said, with EMDR, it can be very intense. This is one of those things where you're like, it's almost like you're dreaming, but you're awake, because usually it'll start off with a question like, when was the first time you felt helpless? And you give a memory. And they ask you all the details about this memory, what you see, what you smell, what you taste, what you feel. And so you paint a full picture of this memory. And while the buzzies are going and while your eyes are doing this, it files that memory back so that it desensitizes you to it. That being said, with EMDR, for anyone who goes through it, decides that it's an avenue they want to explore for trauma treatment, nightmares are a thing. With EMDR and the kind of the concept between the nightmares and EMDR is that nightmares are inherently a way that we are processing a memory of some kind. It's one of those things that, like, I wish that dream interpretation was a real science, but unfortunately it is not. But it is a neurological process that is normal for someone who's been through a very stressful or toxic situation. Doxepin, that is an alternative to trazodone that sometimes has a lesser, it's supposed to assist in not as many nightmares. Yeah. But the fact that nightmares are very emotionally driven, they're also stress induced, and they're neurological. It's not always a guarantee that these medications are going to eradicate nightmares.
Now let's go back to therapy a little bit. How long have you been in therapy?
I started therapy in mid 2016. I started with just a regular, it started out as marriage counseling for my self-destructive behavior and me sabotaging my relationship. But then it quickly turned into therapy for myself. And so I went through some pretty intensive therapy for a little while, and then I moved from Gainesville to Jasper. And I went without therapy for a little while and started noticing the behaviors come up again. And I have been in pretty consistent therapy since 2019. And then I chose to explore the avenue of EMDR about a year ago. So I myself have completed close to 30 sessions of EMDR, and I want to state that that's not the norm.
Okay.
EMDR is typically 12 to 15 sessions depending on the scenario that you're working with, this person's background. For me in particular, because I live with complex PTSD, I did several more sessions as I have experienced trauma, not only growing up and not only within my first marriage, but I've experienced trauma on the job. I've experienced trauma in my friendships. I've experienced trauma in every aspect of my life. So that is why my experience for EMDR is a little more unique than the majority.
So given the complexity and the layers that we're looking at, do you think or do people go to therapy? Is this kind of like a lifetime thing of going to therapy? Is that what it looks like?
No, no. But one perspective that I was given from my own counselor slash therapist is that traumatic events don't just happen, one day. I mean, some can, but that's not the point. The point is that it takes us years to acquire this trauma, right? So naturally, it's going to take quite some time to unlearn just as much as it is to learn about your trauma. We have to unlearn some things as well. And that can take quite a bit of time. I don't want to say that, like, let's say you have 30 years of trauma, it's going to take 30 years to heal, but it's going to take longer than a year or two. And that's not abnormal, and that's not wrong. Some people can process depending on their experiences. Some people can process things a little faster than others. But again, when you get into the complex layers of someone's trauma, it really heavily depends on everything that's involved. Um, One thing about that's kind of misunderstood about counseling and therapy, counseling, in my opinion, this is just how I see it. Counseling is, let's put all the puzzle pieces on the table and try to put them together. Now, once we have done that, now how do we fix it? Therapy is where we learn and unlearn about the nervous system. How do we regulate our behaviors and emotions? It's one thing to name it, naming the behavior, naming the trauma, naming the event that happened is half the battle. Once you're able to name it, then you can contain it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
So counseling is, let's talk about it, let's name it. Therapy is, let's do something about it. Let's fix it, let's unlearn it.
So in terms of a therapeutic approach, is there anything like say DBT or CBT or any other methods that the therapist will use?
Yes. So CBT and DBT are very common. CBT, in my opinion, is talking about being more cognitive of the behaviors that you're doing. Why are we the way that we are? Why are we engaging in these behaviors? What reward or punishment are we getting from these behaviors? And with DBT, this is, and again, in my opinion, being able to articulate, being able to have a dialogue about these behaviors and these thought processes, and why being able to articulate why we are the way that we are.
What to you does healing look like?
What does healing look like? Oh, so for me, healing is learning that we don't have to attend every engagement that we come across. Sometimes there are people who, they don't remember, they don't know the healed you, they only know the old you. And some people don't look past the old self. Sometimes they can't fathom the new self. Healing for me is learning my limits, knowing when to rest, being a little more private about things that like my accomplishments, or being a little more private about who I know, who I engage with. Healing can be learning how to sit in silence and not feeling anxiety about it. Healing for me is having a more calm approach to things, not reacting in anger, not reacting and having to defend myself, just, you know, seeing things objectively has been monumental for me. In addition to the projection that I mentioned earlier, learning that other people's behaviors has more to do with them than us, especially when we're unlearning all of that internalized stuff.
So would one way of your healing look like not being dependent on external validation?
This whole topic is a very much a passion of mine. I remember one of the questions is like, how did I get into studying trauma?
Yeah.
And a lot of it, of course, is my personal experience. Like I mentioned earlier, I've experienced trauma in every aspect of my life. And I've gone through a lot of my life as a traumatized person, but also extremely misunderstood. I've had a past where I have been mean and belligerent and violent, and I've done a lot of mean things to a lot of people. Um, but that was because I was hurting, and that's because I had, and it's not an excuse, it's just an explanation. Um, but I had a lot of unlearning to do, and finally knowing that I wasn't abnormal. Okay, there's a phrase that I've learned recently that has been really great for me. It's an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So I had no idea that I had lived through any trauma at all until I finally went to therapy. I thought it was all normal. And learning that it's not, and that so many other people are going through it too, helps me realize that I'm not alone. With doing counseling and speaking to schools and, doing lectures on this stuff, when I get to hear other people's stories, it is amazing to me because I can then now definitively know that I am not alone.
I know for a time you were the outreach chair for Frontline Wellness. There's got to be a lot going on in that area, in that line of work.
Um, yes. One thing that I really love to talk about when it comes to first responders and those that they serve is that us as first responders, we deal with the same things that we're called to deal with. We have the addicted family member. We have a special needs child. We have PTSD from car accidents. We still live with the same things that we serve others dealing with. We're just held to a different standard. And what I mean by that is that when, in the rare occasion that sometimes, things happen on a call where maybe we end up distressed, and it's not the norm, but we're human too. And sometimes, we experience trauma just like everybody else does. With the frontline wellness stuff, my biggest passion is just bringing a lot of humanity to both sides of crisis. So I am someone who has both responded to others in crisis, but been responded to in crisis. So I've seen both sides. And what I see on both sides is that we all experience the exact same things. We just cope differently.
And that's what I wanted to ask you is about coping. Is there a culture of support or is there a culture of silence?
Oh, okay. So both. It's both. So with law enforcement and the fire service, they are all very much a brotherhood. As we know, the firefighters, they often get to sit down and eat a meal together. Law enforcement, they travel in pairs, if not groups, to certain things, and they check up on each other, and they're all very intertwined with one another. However, with EMS, in my experience, we are more sink or swim. Comparatively, there is a lot of resources and a lot of options for law enforcement and fire, but there's not for EMS. EMS is still relatively new compared to fire and law enforcement. The emergency medical service was not a full-fledged thing until around the 70s, early 80s. Whereas law enforcement and fire service has been around, since the beginning of time, it seems like. Um, and law enforcement and fire services, they have a different rapport than EMS. And so, yes, there is the silence where, there's still the stigma of if you release or if you share that, you're struggling, then you're considered weak. You should stuff it down and keep going. However, I like to use the example of the garbage can. So when our garbage can gets full, naturally we stuff it down and we've got a little bit more space to deal with. But then that becomes full and we keep trying to stuff it down to make more space, but eventually we run out and that trash has got to be taken out. And that's where the explosions happen. That's where the reckless conduct on the job happens. That's where someone gets hurt for no real reason other than someone couldn't control their emotions. And so there's a lot of stigma that comes with opening up yourself to others. My experience when I disclosed that I was suffering and had some severe mental issues going on, I was then deemed the crazy one. I was treated as such. Like, oh, there's I developed a name around the station called Ginger Snaps. Like, have you ever seen a ginger snap? Because I was angry and fighting people all the time. There was a point in time where I had an employee file about an inch and a half thick, full of insubordination, complaints, fighting, write-ups, all of it. And I was treated as, oh, that's just her crazy self. She's just nuts. That's just how she is. And no one really understood that was superficial. I was really suffering and acting out, but people couldn't understand that. And that's not anyone else. That's not necessarily anyone's fault. It's just what happened.
And I don't know if you can speak to this, but one profession I'm thinking about 911 dispatchers. Yeah. So, what's your experience with them?
So it is very common for them to develop PTSD. A lot of it is the unknown. A dispatcher hears, everything happening in real time, but they almost never get the follow-up. They almost never know what happens when that phone hangs up. Or sometimes they're the last voice that someone ever hears. And that can be burdensome. And I don't mean that derogatory or anything in a bad context, but when you know that you're the last person that someone talked to, whether they ended up in a car accident or they took their own life, or maybe domestic violence and they didn't survive it, or they listened to the child who's in the bathroom screaming because they're watching their parents fighting. I mean, you get these images from the things that you're hearing, and it's almost like torture to have the mind think of these scenarios and you don't get an ending. It's just in limbo. And that can be very particularly distressing to dispatchers.
Any final words?
No, I love talking about this. I loved your arrangement of questions. So it was great.
Thank you very much.